Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Archimonde on Mythic.
So you finally got to the final boss, and what a boss it is. Like its heroic counterpart, it is a 3-phase fight. However, unlike heroic, Archimonde will drag himself and your entire raid team into the twisting Nether in phase 3, where you have to do it with completely new mechanics.
Now before we start going over all the abilities and the strategies, it's important that you know certain things. This fight is completely about your DPS. There are certain points that you need to push the boss by in every single phase, and having really strong damage pushes these points a lot earlier and it carries you completely. As for your healers, they have a pretty easy job. Healing in phase 2 can sometimes be a little bit demanding, but the fight on a whole is pretty easy to heal. As for tanks, it's pretty demanding on them. However, again, if you have really high DPS, it makes your tanks' jobs a hell lot easier. And the reason why we bring this up is that if you've been struggling on other encounters based on your DPS being too low, you're not going to have fun on this fight whatsoever. That said, in terms of raid composition, you pretty much have the freedom to bring almost any classes you like. Some classes are definitely better than others, no doubts, but the best advice we can give you really when choosing your composition for this encounter, just bring your strongest DPS and you shouldn't have too many issues. If your DPS can consist of a small mixed group of like 3 to 4 mages and hunters, it will help you a lot in phase 2. Melee DPS are good for both phase 1 and 2, but they tend to drop off in the last phase because there's quite a lot of movement involved and sometimes you don't even have range on the boss. However, Death Knights are incredibly useful with dealing with the Infernals in the last phase, so if you can bring at least 1, you'll be good. 2 is like a perfect number. However, like, it's not like necessary, you don't have to have them, it just makes it a hell lot easier.
Anyway, let's kick it off and talk about phase 1. Your objective in this phase is to push the boss into phase 2 with as little Doomfire patches on the ground as possible. On Mythic, every time the boss casts a Lure of Flames to relocate the fire, it will actually deal a small amount of fire damage to everyone in the raid, per patch on the ground. So if the boss moves, say, 15 patches in a single allure, you will wipe, as everyone will take far too much damage and you'll just instantly die. In Mythic, you do however have the ability to run over the fire patches to store it as a dot on yourself. Each stack of fire you pick up will add 1 stack to the dot, and this dot becomes increasingly nasty and becomes very dangerous on around the 10 stack mark, and it does cap out at 15 stacks. Once your dot times out 12 or so seconds later, you'll deposit the fire spread equally around your character. When you do drop your own fire, you'll actually become immune to it for a short amount of time, but other players' fire you won't become immune from, and if you do explode on someone else, they'll just pick up all your fire and it's very, very bad. This is important, and you will understand why in a moment. So the idea is, before the boss casts his Allure of Flames, you have designated players to pick up the fire and deposit it somewhere after the Allure cast is finished. You'll need to do this every single time, both in phase 1 and phase 2, hence why it's so important that you keep the Doomfire patches as low as possible from the very beginning of the encounter.
So as you can tell clearly, you need to kill the Doomfire Spirits as quickly as you possibly can. That said, even if you instantly kill them within a second of them spawning, they will always spawn a minimum of 10 patches each Doomfire Spirit. And in this phase, really you need to push the boss before the 4th one. So you should only ever have 3 Doomfire Spirits in total, and as a result you'll be dealing with a minimum of 30 patches. This means you'll need to use at least 2 players to deal with them, as only a single player can have 15 stacks. And the real issue with this is that 15 stacks is totally unreasonable on a non-tank, as you're forced to use like basically every single defensive cooldown you have in order to keep that player alive. It's also completely unreasonable for both tanks to do it at the exact same time, because you'll just constantly see tank deaths. There's so many other things going on, the tanks are just going to die from the overload of damage. So you'll have to set up a small group of players to deal with it instead. On our first kill, we actually had a total of 6 people dealing with fire soaking. However, that was playing with around 36 to 42 fire stacks, depending on what pool we had. On our more recent kills, we only have like 4 people or even 3 people dealing with them because they die much quicker, and we only ever have 30 stacks. And that's with 1 tank taking 15 and 3 hunters taking 5 each. So the point we're trying to make here is that the number of people that you use to soak your fire really does depend on the amount of fire you have on the ground, and of course the amount of fire you have is based on how strong your DPS is. It also kind of depends on your healing comp slightly, but generally having lower stacks, so around the 5 to 7 marks on say 3 to 4 targets compared to having 8 to 10 stacks on 2 to 3 targets is much better, especially like if you don't have a shit ton of paladins.
So that's how the Doomfire Spirits work. Before we elaborate on it, first we'll cover the Shadowfell Burst. Now on Mythic, this is applied to 3 ranged targets rather than just 1. The damage dealt while landing is still very, very high, so as a result you're forced to either soak players or have people solo soak with immunities or massive damage reductions. You can also cheese this ability by either blinking or displacer beasting, providing that you do land on a large group of players, but if you land on them at a bad time or multiple people land on them at the same time, it's likely that they are actually going to die. Now because 3 people were affected by this ability, you need to quickly work out who needs to be soaked and who doesn't. The way that we do it is people who are soloing say absolutely nothing, and the people that actually need help will call out their location based on a ranged perspective. So in this example on screen now, where we actually soak all 3, this player would be left, this player would be middle, and this player would be right. But of course this might change because the right person might be in the middle next time, so just always be aware where the other ones are so you can call out where you need to be soaked accurately. You also may need melee to come out and soak in these situations, but more often than not you should be fine. It's very rare that all 3 people need to be soaked. Just make sure you spread out and react quickly and you should have more than enough time.
For your tanks, Death Brand is still in play. The Death Cooler and the stacking debuff that it applies work exactly the same as Heroic, except it really fucking hurts. You need to make sure that your tanks keep swapping each time this ability comes in. However, you would need to tank both the boss and the ad at the same time at certain points because of the other tank picking up Doomfire. On the 3rd and 4th application of the debuff, you'll start to notice that you're taking massive shadow damage and you need to start using either a huge damage reduction, or in the later parts of phase 1, of course, you'll have the orb from the pillars, which completely carries with you. But in phase 2, they're also up, so yeah, you'll notice that damage really picks up. And on the 5th application, it's very close to one-shot territory, and ideally all Death Coolers should be well dead before this point.
And finally in this phase you'll also have the Desecrate pillars from 85% of the boss's health and onwards. Now these work the exact same way, however it is way more important that everyone has the orb buff kept up for the entire of phase 1, as the pulsing AoE from the actual pillars themselves becomes pretty insane. One thing that you do need to know as a tank with these pillars is how they spawn. There is actually hundreds of preset locations that these pillars can spawn in, and they do seem random, but they're actually not. They spawn based on how close the boss is to these preset locations, and whether or not there is a Doomfire Spirit near these locations. The areas they spawn in is kind of up to you, but we encourage you to try and place them as close to the ranged as possible, as having to move a lot is a lot of downtime. Just make sure you have the boss near these locations, which you'll learn pretty fast yourself, and you face the boss away from these locations when the Doomfire Spirit is about to spawn.
So there is all the abilities in play. Now all you need to know is the timings and where to place the Doomfire. So let's go from the start. You want to pull the boss and you want to keep him in his starting position. The first Doomfire Spirit will spawn, you want to destroy it, just kill it as soon as you possibly can. Death Brand will come in on one tank, meanwhile you'll want your other tank to go and pick up the fire. Allura Flames will come in. As soon as that's gone off, you want your tank with the fire stacks to go and deposit all of his fire on the left hand side of the boss. It's at this point you might want to stop DPS and wait for a Shadowfell burst. If you push the boss past 85% before the Shadowfell burst comes in, it actually fucks timers and makes it worse for you. So what you need to do is wait for the burst, soak them, and then push the boss below 85%. This just resets some timers and allows the second Doomfire Spirit to spawn at a much later time, so you have way more time to fuck around in this phase. The first Desecrate will spawn. It's at this point you want your raid to move over towards it, you want your range to stack on a single spot and pick up a single orb. You want the melee to do the exact same, but with another orb, and make sure your tanks are in range at the exact same time. The second Doomfire Spirit will spawn, kill it off as soon as you possibly can, and at the same time another Death Brand will come in. While one of your tanks is dealing with the Death Brand and the boss at the exact same time, you want your other tank to go and pick up the fire stacks from the original tank patch, but then go and move over the new fire and pick up 5 stacks. So this should now mean that he's on 15 stacks. Any remaining stacks that are left from the second Doomfire Spirit, have one of your hunters pick it up instead. And if you killed the second Doomfire Spirit perfectly, he should only have 5 stacks. While this is going on, a second Desecrate will spawn, and again we move our entire raid towards it. But before we leave the old one, we make sure everyone refreshes on an orb, and then we move over. But we make sure that as we're moving, we have our ranged and healers completely spread, and make sure they don't instantly pick up an orb on arrival. At the exact same time, you'll have an allure cast. As soon as the cast is over, have your tank position the fire again on the left-hand side of the boss, and have the hunter mirror it on the right-hand side of the boss. The second burst will come in, make sure of course you're still spread. As soon as everyone is soaked, move back towards the pillar and you can now refresh with another orb. Doomfire Spirit 3 will come in, again kill it off as soon as you possibly can, and roughly around the same time you'll get your third Desecrator as well. But you can pretty much ignore this one, you should be able to use all the orbs from the second pillar for the rest of the phase, so you can kind of free for all the ones on the third pillar. The third Deathbrand will come in on one of your tanks. While this is going on, have your other tank go and pick up his 15 stacks, and at the exact same time you'll want your first hunter to go pick up his 5, and then have 2 other players, again ideally hunters or mages, go and pick up the fire from Doomfire 3. And again, if you kill this Doomfire Spirit nice and quickly, you should only have 5 stacks on each player. The allure will come in, and then we drop the fires. Again, the tank on the left-hand side, and the hunters and the mages in a row on the right-hand side. You'll then get Desecrate 4, but by this time it's irrelevant, and you should be looking into transitioning into Phase 2.
So once again, this whole phase is kill Doomfires. It's super important, even if you do slightly less damage on the boss. If these Doomfires don't die quick enough, you're just going to wipe immediately into Phase 2. So really work on getting those Doomfire spirits down as soon as you can. Now going into Phase 2, you still will have Allure of Flames and Deathbrand from Phase 1 that has to be dealt with in the exact same way. However, DPS should be way more focused on the Death Cooler in this phase, as tanks won't have the Desecrate Orbs to kind of carry them. And of course you'll have Focused and Wrought Chaos and the Chains, and they are completely different on Mythic. Now, Focus and Wrought Chaos on Mythic is applied to the entire raid rather than just one set of people. This means you'll have 10 players set to send off beams to 10 other players 3 times per one of these chaos phases. Now, the beams do a crazy amount of damage, so it's incredibly important that you only get hit by the beam that you are connected with. If you're hit by 2 beams, that will easily drop you to 5%, 3 will kill you unless you have an immunity. Now, this can be incredibly difficult to do, especially without add-ons. However, Exhaustus Raid Tools is here to carry you. It comes with a plugin that allows you to see every single beam and what direction it is going to be shot out in as a radar display. The green lines indicate other players' beams, the orange line indicates you and your partner's beams, and the pink lines indicate any beams that will be hitting you unless you move. We generally have the raid spread out in a circle, and this makes the likelihood of you having to move a lot lower than if you was in another formation. You will, however, occasionally have to move to avoid getting hit by 2 or even 3 of them at once. The best way to move during these chaoses is to actually run up and down your partnered line, so you'll be running directly towards or away from your partner. This way your beam should remain in the exact same direction rather than left and right, because if you're going left and right and it's going all over the place, you're just going to fuck someone else up, and most of the time that'll be a melee DPS and they'll be really pissy with you. So for every Focus and Wrought Chaos, we hold the same formation and have rough locations in which we should be stood in. We have our melee at the top of the circle with the tanks standing slightly out. We have our hunters and mages on the left hand side stood near their fire patches. We have 2 healers also on the left hand side because they're going to be keeping up the hunters and mages when they get their stacks. 2 healers on the right hand side to keep the tanks up, and we have our range spread around the bottom side of this circle. Now, you will have to deal with 3 Wrought and Focus Chaos sets in total in Phase 2, and we organise healing cooldowns for each, apart from on the last one, where we actually only have a rally, as you want to be saving some of the cooldowns for going into the next phase.
Now, Chains and Mythic work very similar to how they work in Heroic. They just do increasing ticking damage and explode once you move 30 yards away from them. However, instead of dealing raid-wide damage when they explode, on Mythic they just deal lethal damage to anyone within 25 yards of them. If you go further than 25 yards, you take no damage from them whatsoever. This means whenever each of the 3 chains are being broke by the player who's running away from them, you need the entire raid to be away from the chains, otherwise they're going to die. The best way of dealing with these chains is breaking all of them at the exact same time. However, if you break them too fast, you will definitely kill someone. To counter those types of deaths, we simply wait a few seconds and have someone in our raid team do a 3-second countdown. And providing no one moves slowly and the chains weren't broke too early or too late, no one should die. When running away from the chains, you are sometimes forced to run in a bit of an odd direction, but as a rule of thumb, we try and make it so the tanks always run towards the tank healers, and the rest of the raid can just pretty much go wherever the fuck they like. As long as they're not running into fire or running into stupid shit, it's absolutely fine. And again, Exhaustus Raid Tool also displays this within the radar. It shows the exact chain radius, the explosion radius. So you really should use it. It completely carries you. It's awesome.
So they're all the mechanics that you will be dealing with in phase 2, but once again, this phase is entirely dependent on timings and knowing the crossover points, knowing when it's really fucking horrible and knowing when it's good. So let's go through this phase so you get an idea of how we break our chains and how we soak our fire. Now you'll get your first raw and focused chaos. Just make sure you have formed your circle and you deal with it properly. As soon as the third beam was hit and the raw and focused chaos has ended, you'll get your first set of chains. With these you can pretty much run in any directions. Just make sure as a tank you are in range of your tank healers because you are going to be taking some damage from stuff, but most importantly just don't die. Once you've broken them, you want to start soaking fires as the allure comes in 8 seconds later. While soaking, a death brand will come in. Make sure you all switch to it and blow it up as soon as possible. After this, you want your Doomfire players to drop their fires and you'll have another set of wrought chaos. After this first hit from the chaos, you'll then get chains. However, these chains are pretty nasty and breaking them during the raw and focused chaos isn't safe at all because everyone has to move, and if everyone's moving, everyone's going to get triple hit and instantly die. So instead you are forced to wait until the chaos is over. Healers, make sure you spot heal the chains players as they will be taking that extra ticking damage just from having a chain on them. Once the last beam has hit, you want to look at breaking your chains, and at the same time the boss will cast another death brand. Make sure it's on the right tank and make sure you completely annihilate it. You'll also need to go and soak fires at this exact point, so make sure your chains are broken pretty quickly so you don't have to panic soak, because if you panic soak, people are going to get ridiculously high stacks when they shouldn't be. You always want to try and keep your stacks roughly at the same level. It's also at this point that the boss should really be around the 55% mark, and you'll start getting the Dreadstalkers and the single Overfiend. Make sure the Overfiend is picked up by a tank because its melee hits are very strong, and set up a rotation of interrupts. It's a good idea to include range DPS in this rotation, as sometimes you are forced to move with the mob because of the chains, and the Heart of Argus cast will knock your entire raid to 50%. It's super nasty, he stands still to cast it so melee can't always get there, so just always know when it's coming in and be prepared to interrupt it. Now the Dreadstalkers you can more or less ignore unless you're a dotter. Just make sure you don't get locked out of casting by moving out of their circle. However, it is possible that they're up during the next raw and focused chaos phase. Just make sure you either use a personal cooldown while you're in their circle, or you run out of the circle staying directly on the line towards your partner. It's always worth just getting hit by the circle rather than getting double hit or making someone else get double hit. Just use a personal cooldown and you should be fine. Now after the fires have been placed, we actually move the boss towards the dark portal and stack loosely around him, usually in a line. This allows us to cleave on the adds, but primarily it's set up for the next chains. The chains come in, we roar and break the chains after 3 seconds and move back into our circle ready for the chaos that comes in immediately afterwards. If your chains are in a bad position, you can really get fucked over by this next set of chaoses if you didn't do it this way, especially because you're going to pick up a lure straight away afterwards, so generally moving like this will help you out a lot. This last chaos is definitely the most difficult one because of the adds, and again, just make sure you use your personal cooldowns or move out of the circles. During this chaos, you'll also get a death brand, and it is incredibly important that this add dies super fast as there is so much damage going all over everyone. Now the moment the last chaos hits, have your fire soakers go out and pick it all up. We usually roar for this as you have a lot less time to soak compared to the other times that you have. A couple seconds later you'll have a new set of chains. Again, we just move away from them and break them after 3 seconds. And at this point, you really should be looking to transition into the last phase. You want to stack up under the boss and nuke any of the adds down, otherwise they'll actually go into the Nether with you. If you've managed to reach the 4th raw and focused chaos at this point, because of a lack of DPS, you can instead transition him while that is active, because if he starts the cast to go into the last phase, it will actually remove the effect as soon as he starts the cast. So even if you've all got those horrible debuffs on you, if he starts the cast, the debuff will just immediately drop and you'll be fine. If you're constantly wiping because you are hitting this 4th set of chaoses and you wipe to the allure immediately afterwards, we would actually recommend that you bloodlust phase 2. However, this will make phase 3 a hell of a lot harder for you. We'll be covering this later on in the video, so if you want to know more, stick around.
Now, as soon as the boss does finish his Nether Ascension cast, your raid and any adds alive will be dragged into the Nether. The boss will also heal for 10% of his maximum health, so you'll now be fighting him from 50% onwards. This new phase brings 6 new abilities that you have to deal with, and all of the abilities are on a different duration on separate timers. And as they're on separate timers, this actually creates horrible overlaps, which is arguably the hardest part of this phase. However, this is where your DPS comes in. If you manage to save Bloodlust and your single target and execute damage is really strong, this phase is a complete joke because you can avoid everything that's difficult about it. That said, there are still 6 abilities and you still need to understand how they will work. One of the abilities the boss will do is Dark Conduits. What will happen is that the boss will target a random ranged player and spawn a conduit under them which looks like a big shadowy orb. This deals damage to anyone stood on top of it when it spawns, and the conduit itself lasts for the rest of the encounter. Whilst the conduit is active and just sat there, it doesn't do anything whatsoever. However, if a conduit spawns on top of another one, they explode and you pretty much wipe. And when the boss casts this ability, he always does it in a set of 3. So he'll cast the ability 3 times, each time spawning a brand new conduit. So as they're spawning, it's important as a ranged DPS or a healer, you're not stood on top of an old conduit, and ideally you're not stood on top of other players because you want to try and minimize the amount of splash damage that's going out. It's also important that you try and place these conduits in decent locations, especially towards at the start of the fight, because you want to maximize the amount of room that you have at the end of the fight. By placing these conduits like on edges or right at the back of the platform, it sets you up a lot better than if you was to put them right in the middle of the room. However, if one does spawn in the middle of the room really early for whatever reason, it's not a massive problem because again, they're completely harmless, providing no one is stood on top of them when conduits are coming in again, so just keep that in mind. The boss will also do something called Seething Corruption, and this ability is pretty much your modern day Hygen dance. The boss will just light up areas of the platform in fire, and then a couple of seconds later it'll ignite, and it pretty much instantly kills anyone without a damage reduction or an immunity. All you need to do is just simply move into the areas that are clear, and you'll survive. Now the fire initially will look completely random to you, but it really isn't. There's 4 patterns in total, and each pattern has 3 waves of fire that you need to move from. There is a link to all the patterns in the description of the video. We'd recommend that you learn them. It's not super important, it's very easy to dodge anyway. As a rule of thumb, if you stand in the middle of the room, it makes pretty much every single pattern really easy to deal with. So use that to start with, learn the patterns, and you'll be absolutely fine. Now the order in which you'll actually have to deal with the patterns, that is completely random. However, you cannot have the same pattern every single time. It needs to rotate through all the patterns first before you see the same one twice. Now, while the fires are going on, it is important that you always have a tank within melee range of the boss, just to prevent the boss from hitting random people. However, sometimes the entire melee area is completely coated in fire, which means the tanks will take damage from it. This is where you want to be using your external or personal cooldowns to survive. There's not really any other point in this phase where the tanks will be taking a crazy amount of damage. So yeah, use cooldowns there and you should be fine.
Now, some things that the tanks will actually have to deal with is something called Source of Chaos. Now the boss will target whatever tank has the highest threat and spawn a crystal directly in front of the boss that will begin to channel a beam onto that tank. Now the beam deals damage that stacks up on whoever is stood inside it, and it will actually begin to push the tank off the back of the platform. Now the more people that stand in the beam, the weaker the pushback effect is, as well as the weaker the damage is. There is 2 different ways of dealing with these Source of Chaoses. You can either let your tank flat out die, this will make the Chaos Crystal despawn and therefore more damage can go on the boss, or you can kill it off every single time while having people soak. Generally what you want to do, it does really depend on how many battle reses you have available, is that you do want to let your tank die half of the time because getting more damage on the boss allows him to die quicker and therefore you don't have to deal with really awful overlaps later on in the fight. But one thing you do want to take into account, do not let your tank die by falling off the edge of the platform because you can't res him there. You just want to let him die from the dot that he has, just make sure he doesn't get any healing and even grip him closer in if he is going to be knocked off.
And as a tank, make sure you're stood in front of the crystal when it spawns. Don't be on like the left or the right hand side of it, otherwise you're just going to be knocked off it instantly. In this phase you'll also see Void Stars. Just like from Heroic, these guys will fly towards a player and explode and knock them off. If you swap to them immediately, they're pretty much a non-issue. You just need to make sure you prioritize them and always kill them off first. You may actually even want to assign players to cover certain areas of the room just to make sure no one ever gets hit. These stars always spawn in sets of 5. You'll have 2 spawn melee, 1 on the right, 1 on the left. You have 2 spawn at range, 1 on the left and 1 on the right. And then you'll have 1 that will spawn directly at the back of the room. We actually assign players to each one just to slow them, just so that no one gets caught.
Now you also keep Reign of Chaos, and this works the exact same way as it did in Heroic Phase 3. Circles will spawn in a staggered fashion and Infernals will land on them. Now when they land, they deal a massive amount of damage to anyone stood inside them, as well as raid-wide damage. We organise healing cooldowns for every single wave of these meteors. As a rule of thumb, providing that you're not within the actual animation, you should be safe from the amount of damage. But if you can go a little bit further away while maintaining your high damage, it's probably better that you do that. Now these Infernals come down every 60 seconds to start off with, but they do end up speeding up, and they also increase in numbers. So the first and second set of Reign of Chaos will always be 3 Infernals, the third, fourth and fifth are always 4 Infernals, and the sixth set of Reign of Chaos is 5 Infernals, and you should never see the 7th set because, yeah, the boss should be dead by then. But the idea is that you kill the boss before the 6th set comes in, as it's too crazy to really kill them off at that point. Now these Infernals need to die extremely quickly. They start their pulsing AoE damage a lot sooner than Heroic, and it hurts a hell of a lot more than Heroic. However, RNGesus isn't always with you. These Infernals will always spawn on random players, but sometimes it's the same player over and over again. And if they're on top of each other, it is incredibly important that you split them up as soon as you possibly can, because the healing aura they have on each other is ridiculously strong. We have one Death Knight grip into one corner and one grip into the opposite corner, and have Hunters torn any remaining ones out to the left and the right hand side. We just make sure everyone swaps to them immediately and call out if they actually need any help killing their ad. Now the best way to kill these isn't really to kill them in like a specific, oh I'm always going to kill star or whatever, it's just best to kill them in the order that they spawn. Because it is staggered, it is a lot easier to kill them off one by one rather than waiting, oh purple hasn't spawned yet so I'm just going to keep nuking the boss. No, always damage the Infernals. These Infernals have to die, it's so important. Just kill them as soon as they spawn and you should be fine.
And the last ability that the boss does in this phase is something called Mark of the Legion. Now this is a debuff that is applied to 4 targets, however each debuff has a different duration. At the end of this duration, the player that is affected will take a massive amount of damage that is split between all targets nearby, and also they'll receive a knockback effect that is also split in intensity between everyone nearby. You'll also receive a debuff that increases the amount of damage you take from this ability by a shit ton. However, it will drop before the next set of Marker Legions come round. However, it does prevent you from soaking multiple Legions in one set, otherwise you're going to be one-shot. And you will also be one-shot if you don't split the damage between enough targets, even if you immunity it, because if you immunity it, you will still be affected by the knockback, and it will be so strong that you'll almost instantly fly off the platform. The only way you can sort of get around it, if you time a perfect blink or a perfect alter time or something like that, generally soloing it is never a good idea. So to counter this ability, because it's 4 different debuffs, each time you're hit by it you can't soak again until the next set, you need to form 4 groups. We have 2 groups set up in melee and 2 set up at range. When the ability comes in, everyone runs to their set marker, gets hit by the debuff, so no one gets one shot and no one flies off the platform. However, to do this without add-ons again is pretty damn difficult. In the description of this video is a link to an add-on that will assist you with this. How the add-on works is that it simply will just assist you and tell you exactly which group to run to, with both a text and an audio alert. Now how the add-on works is that it assumes that everyone in group 1 and in group 2 are in melee, so they will always be assigned to melee groups, and that group 3 and 4 are ranged. Make sure you set up raid icons like you see on screen now, so you have yellow and orange are melee and purple and green are ranged. And also make sure that they're spread apart from one another, and make sure the distance between melee and range are large enough to prevent players from being knocked back into other groups. Also note that the knockback effect comes directly from the debuffed player, and the knockback effect that hits the debuffed player is based on the direction that he is facing with his character. So make sure the player that does have the Marker Legion is directly in front of the group, so people are knocked away from the boss rather than towards it or even off the platform. And make sure the player that has the debuff is not facing away from the edge of the platform. Treat it like a disengage, because that's more or less what it is. So there are all the abilities in play, and as you can see, they're pretty simple and they're pretty easy to deal with. But the problem is that they're all on separate timers and you end up getting overlaps. And timing in this phase is very, very important. So we're going to go straight back to the start of the phase and we're going to explain the entire phase from start to finish. So as soon as you come down and land on the platform, kill off any ads that you had from the previous phase and go straight on the boss. He'll start casting his conduits, make sure you put them around the edges, and then you'll get your first Mark of the Legion. Let your add-on carry you, and then briefly afterwards you'll have your first Reign of Chaos. This is when you want to use your first cooldowns, and of course, split them up and kill them off as soon as you possibly can. After this, you'll have your first source of chaos. Now this one we actually decide to kill off because you can't actually sacrifice your tanks on every single one because you simply don't have enough battle reses, and you need both tanks to be alive for like the majority of this phase. So we kill this one off. It's the easiest one to kill off, but you do need everyone to swap to it because 10 seconds or so after it spawns, you'll get your first Seething Corruption. As soon as you've dealt with your dance, you'll then have stars. Kill them off. A couple of seconds later, you'll then have the Mark of the Legion. Let your add-on carry you, and then you'll have Reign of Chaos number 2, and this is where you want to use your second set of CDs. After this, you'll have your second source of chaos. This is the one where we let the tanks die, and then we just immediately battle res afterwards. Just make sure you have players inside the beam, and you're no longer healing the tank, you're only healing the people that are soaking, and after that, you'll get another Seething Corruption. Towards the end of the Seething Corruption, the boss will start to cast conduits. This one is actually really important. If you can have classes run out and use immunities or deterrences or anything just to survive the fire, trying to bait the conduits in decent places, you should definitely do it because it just makes everything a whole lot cleaner. As soon as you dealt with those conduits, you'll get another Mark of the Legion, let the add-on carry you, and then you'll get a stars and the third Reign of Chaos overlapping at the exact same time. Make sure you kill the stars first before you swap to the infernals. If you swap to the stars like really quick, it's actually possible to kill them before the infernals almost. But, you know, you're not going to do that every single time. Just make sure you kill the stars, then kill the infernals, and then you'll have another Seething Corruption. After the dance, you have another source of chaos. This again, you sacrifice your tank if you have the battle reses. If not, you're going to have to kill it off. You'll then get stars. Just make sure you kill them off as soon as you possibly can. And then you'll get your first shit overlap. What will happen is that you'll get Mark of the Legion and Reign of Chaos at the exact same time. Your first 3 Mark of the Legion debuffs will time out, but on your 4th, you'll actually have an Infernal land at the exact same time. What we do is that we use our cooldowns from the first Reign of Chaos, so it goes back to CD1. For us, this so happens to be an Aura Mastery, but we also place a barrier on top of the group that is getting hit with a Legion. And sometimes we even throw a Spirit Link in there, as well as personal cooldowns on that group, just so if the Infernal does land directly on top of that group at the exact same time as the Legion going off, no one takes any damage whatsoever, because they're just so pumped full of fucking personals. As soon as you've killed those adds off, you'll then get conduits, deal with those, again try and put them in decent locations, you have your stars again, kill them off nice and quick, you'll then have a dance, and directly coming out of the dance, you'll get a Mark of the Legion. It doesn't really affect you too much, it just prevents you from moving into your location about a second or 2 less than what you would usually have. So you need to make sure that you move really quick and react very quickly on this one. This is usually a good time to use your Raw. After you've dealt that Mark of the Legion, you'll then have another source of chaos, let your tank die, battle res him up if you have that available, otherwise you're forced to kill it, and then you'll have the worst overlap in this entire phase. What will happen is that you'll have a Seething Corruption again, but towards the end of the duration of it, you'll have conduits and Reign of Chaos at the exact same time. This means that your entire raid team is pretty much clustered in one little area because you're all doing the dance. The conduits are spawning on top of you, which means you don't have much room to run with them, and you have the Reign of Chaos landing directly on your head at the exact same time. What we do for this particular overlap is, again, we use a Raw, so people can disperse as soon as they possibly can after the Seething Corruption. We have people use Shieldtronics, as in the health pot alternative, personal cooldowns, as well as our cooldowns that we use from the second Reign of Chaos. There's not really too much advice we can give you here, apart from dispersing. You just need to get out of the clusterfuck of people as soon as you possibly can, without running on top of conduits, and without standing within the circles of the Infernals. And you need to split up the Infernals ASAP and kill them, because this is the 5th one, this is the worst one. Get past this with a lot of people alive, the fight is over, unless your damage is appalling.
Yeah, it's quite good at this point as well. If you do have deterrences and ice blocks, once again, fuck off away from people. Maybe bait out an Infernal spawn, maybe bait out a conduit spawn. All of that kind of stuff is a perfect time to do it at this point.
And as soon as you've got over that shit overlap, you'll have Mark of the Legion, followed by stars, followed by another dance, and at this point, you'll then have your next Reign of Chaos. But this has happened 30 seconds after the previous one. So at this point, abilities are coming in really quick. This is almost like the pseudo enrage of the boss. If you hit these Infernals, ignore them. You do not have time to kill these Infernals and then go back on the boss, because the next Infernals are going to come in again.
Yeah.
You're literally just going to get spammed with mechanics at this point. So if you get these Infernals, which is what we did on our first kill, we literally just ignored them and nuked the boss.
It's also really important that as the Infernals come down, if you can survive it, then spread for the conduits.
Yeah.
We didn't, and we barely fucking killed it. So yeah, the conduits do come in while these guys are alive before they start pulsating, so do try and be spread out. Just spam everything you got, and just hopefully the boss will die as that happens.
Yeah, I mean, this last phase, again, if you have the add-on carries you so hard on the Mark of the Legion because it is a dynamic add-on, so if all the melee get the debuff, it will still split people equally.
Yeah, exactly.
Very, very clever add-on.
Take people from the right places and put them in there.
And apart from that, it's just killing the Infernals. And you kill the Infernals quickly, and no one dies to stupid shit like dances. The Chaos is super easy to deal with. The Stars are super easy to deal with. Providing you don't get the 5th Infernals or the 6th Infernals, it's an easy kill, really.
Yeah. Now, before we end the video, one last thing we didn't cover is when you should be using your Bloodlust, when you should be using your Ring, because DPS is such an important factor with this encounter. It's really important to know when to use these things. But it's super hard for us to say because it completely depends on how strong your gear is and your DPS is. You might have really good Phase 1 DPS and you might have really shit Phase 3 DPS. It's really hard to tell, so it kind of depends on what you want to do. However, this is how we did it. Now, we save Bloodlust on the pool and we just Ring on the pool. Next time we use our Ring is actually the transition from Phase 1 to Phase 2, but we make sure that the explosion only hits the boss. You will probably have a Dreadlord alive at this point, so just make sure you drag him away, and he should be relatively low health just from cleave and stuff, so it's actually quite cool if you can throw kill shots or just executes onto that, making your Ring explosion on the boss even bigger. That's a little whore tip for you. This way, you're right ahead at the start of Phase 2, and it also makes dodging that 4th set of Chaoses all that much easier. The next ring we use is actually during the 3rd set of Wrought and Focus Chaos when the Dreadlord spawns. This time it's really hard to let it just explode on the Dreadlord or just explode on the boss because you normally have a wave of ads coming in at this point as well. It's just super annoying. So just let it explode and everything. You're kind of mainly using it just for the damage increase. You may also want to use your second pot in the second phase during the 3rd Wrought Chaos if you are super struggling making the damage, but ultimately it is of course better used for the last phase. And once again, if you really can't make it at this point, this is when you use Bloodlust as well. Now the next time you use your ring will be in Phase 3 when the first set of stars spawn. It isn't actually for the stars at all. It just so happens that this is the best time to use it in this phase because you pretty much got nothing else to do. So as soon as the stars spawn, we pop Bloodlust, we pop our rings, we pop our 5 minutes, we pop every single last thing that we got at this point because the stars just demolish. You quickly swap to the boss and then you get a huge explosion on the boss because you get to stand still for so long. So it's absolutely great if you can save everything for this, because otherwise the fight will probably last a little bit too long. The next ring you will be using is actually the last time you'll even have the opportunity to do it, so use it for whenever it really suits you. We personally use it a few seconds before Infernals 5 and have our ring instantly explode on some of the last Infernals, because a fully stacked ring will insta-kill an Infernal. It can nearly insta-kill 2 of them, and when that happens it's fucking hilarious, but it also saves you a hell of a lot of trouble and makes it so you can switch back to the boss easier. So that's when we use our rings. Of course, you're going to be doing a long progression and there will be chances for you to work out when the ring is best for you because it's so determined on comp. But yeah, that's when we use it, and hopefully that's helpful.
But yep, that's everything you really need to know of this fight. It's a fucking good encounter. It's been a great tier.
Yeah, the only thing I'd criticize about this encounter is that how much add-ons seem really needed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like doing the chaoses without add-ons is a pain in the ass. And the thing is with this fight, though, there's tons of different ways of doing it, at least. Like, you got Paragon strat for doing the Wrought Chaoses, and you got, like, the Method strat with the radars and stuff like that. So it's up to you what you want to do. This is just what we did. There's fucking tons of ways of killing this boss, but yeah.
And there's lots of Zerg tactics now with
yes, it's hilarious.
Level, which are pretty interesting. But regardless, guys, thank you very much for watching. Drop us down a like if it helped you get the kill. And we shall be seeing you in Legion.
Yep.
More videos coming soon.
Thanks for watching.